The cartel thought they had just grabbed another helpless victim, a young woman, alone, with no backup. But Claire Morgan wasn't just anyone. She was the daughter of a legendary trucker, a man who had survived wars, outmaneuvered gangsters, and knew every back road like the back of his hand. Now, as she fought for her life, her father was already on his way, and nothing would stop him. What would you do if someone took your family? This cartel made the worst mistake of their lives, and now they're about to pay. Like, comment, and subscribe for more insane stories. The desert highway stretched for miles, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. Claire Morgan adjusted her backpack and took a deep breath of the warm evening air. The truck stop behind her buzzed with life, drivers fueling up, engines rumbling, and distant voices sharing road stories over stale coffee. It was the kind of place her father, Jack Ironclad Morgan, had warned her about. "Never let your guard down on the road, kid," he had told her countless times. "Not everyone out here is just passing through." But Claire had grown up in this world. She had spent her childhood riding in the cab of her father's 18-wheeler, learning the rhythms of the road, the unspoken codes between truckers, and most importantly, how to handle herself in a tough situation. She never saw the black SUV creeping up behind her. The moment she stepped toward the lot, her boot barely touching the pavement, a strong arm clamped over her mouth. Her scream was swallowed into the thick leather of a gloved hand. Before she could react, a second pair of hands grabbed her arms, twisting them behind her back with practiced ease. Her instincts kicked in: fight, escape, move. She kicked backward, her steel-toed boot connecting with someone's shin. A muffled curse, a stagger. It wasn't enough. A third man grabbed her, wrapping an arm around her waist and lifting her off the ground as if she weighed nothing. Duct tape, cold against her skin, pressing over her lips. Her mind raced. "Think, Claire, think!" she thrashed, kicking wildly as they shoved her toward the SUV. Its side door slid open, revealing the dark interior where a fourth man sat waiting. His face was hidden behind a black ski mask, but his eyes gleamed with amusement. "Feisty one," he muttered in Spanish. "This should be fun." Claire twisted her wrist, trying to reach the small knife strapped to her ankle, a gift from her father. But they were too fast. One final shove and she was inside. The doors slammed shut. The SUV roared to life, tires screeching as they sped away from the truck stop and into the vast emptiness of the desert. Miles away, Jack Morgan sat behind the wheel of his 18-wheeler, his hands gripping the steering wheel with the calm confidence of a man who had seen it all. The CB radio crackled, playing snippets of conversations from truckers up and down the highway. He sipped his coffee, eyes scanning the road. Then his phone vibrated. Jack wasn't a man who lived glued to technology. His life was the highway. But the moment he saw the message, every nerve in his body went cold. "We have your daughter. You know what to do." His fingers tightened around the phone. His jaw clenched. The cartel didn't realize who they had just messed with. Jack didn't call the cops. He didn't panic. He didn't waste time wondering how or why. He simply turned his truck around. The 18-wheeler rumbled as he pulled onto the highway, shifting gears with expert precision. The world outside blurred as his focus narrowed to a single goal: find them, destroy them, bring her home. Inside the SUV, Claire sat perfectly still, forcing herself to breathe, to think. The men spoke in Spanish, discussing a delivery. She knew what that meant. She had seen the stories, overheard the truck stop warnings. Girls taken, never seen again. But she wasn't just another girl. She was Jack Morgan's daughter. And these men had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The SUV sped through the desert, its tires kicking up a thick cloud of dust as the sun dipped below the horizon. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and tension. Claire sat in the back, her wrists bound in front of her with zip ties, the sticky residue of duct tape still clinging to her lips. She had stopped struggling, for now. The man in the front passenger seat, the one who seemed to be in charge, kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. His name was Luis, and he was older than the others, his face weathered from a life spent in the underworld. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "She's too calm," he muttered in Spanish. The driver, a younger guy with a tattoo crawling up his neck, scoffed. "So? She's tied up. She's got nowhere to go." Luis wasn't convinced. He had done this before, dozens of times, probably more. But something about this girl was different. He could see it in her eyes. Most kidnapped victims screamed, cried, begged for mercy. Claire wasn't doing any of that. She was just waiting. He turned in his seat, studying her. "Who are you?" Claire didn't answer. Luis reached out, gripping her chin roughly and forcing her to look at him. His fingers dug into her skin. "I asked you a question, little girl." Still, she said nothing. She held his gaze, her blue eyes cold, unwavering. Luis's lips curled into a smirk. "I know your type. You think your daddy's gonna come riding in, save you like some American cowboy." The men in the back chuckled. One of them, the youngest, leaned closer and yanked Claire's ponytail hard, forcing her head back. "Maybe we should send him a little video," he sneered. "Let him know what happens when you mess with us." Claire clenched her jaw as pain shot through her scalp, but she still didn't react. Luis sighed and let go of her chin, shaking his head. She doesn't get it yet. He leaned forward, opening the glove compartment and pulling out a pistol. He turned back to her, holding it loosely in his grip. "This," he said, lifting the gun slightly. "This is how the world works. Not your daddy, not your little trucker friends. This is power." The other men laughed, nodding in agreement. Claire shifted slightly, keeping her hands loose, careful not to make any sudden movements. They thought they had all the control. They were wrong. Luis waved the gun in front of her face. "You don't want to talk? Fine. But you better start thinking about what happens next. Because trust me." The SUV suddenly lurched, tires skidding as the driver slammed on the brakes. "What the hell?" Luis shouted. The headlights caught the shape of something massive in the distance, a silhouette standing still, blocking the road. A semi-truck. The driver cursed, gripping the wheel. "Where did that come from?" Claire knew exactly where it came from. Her father had found them. And now, they were out of time. The SUV skidded to a stop, dust billowing in the headlights as the cartel members cursed and scrambled to assess the situation. The massive semi-truck in front of them sat like an immovable force, its chrome grille reflecting the moonlight. The unmistakable roar of its idling engine sent a low vibration through the ground. Claire's heart pounded. She knew that truck, knew it better than anything. Jack Morgan was here. "What the hell is this?" the driver muttered, gripping the wheel. "Where did he come from?" Luis narrowed his eyes, tilting his head as he studied the truck. His instincts screamed that something was off. Truckers didn't block roads, they kept moving. But this one was waiting. Luis tapped the dashboard. "Go around him." The driver hesitated, then swerved toward the side of the road. The moment he did, the semi's headlights flared, its horn blasting like a war cry. The SUV's tires skidded in the loose gravel, and for the first time, Claire saw something she hadn't seen before. Fear. The cartel members tensed. Luis clenched his jaw, muttering a curse. This isn't just a trucker, he realized. It's her old man. Before anyone could react, the semi lurched forward. Not fast, just enough to send a message. There's nowhere to run. The driver slammed the gear shift into reverse, but before he could move, the semi's floodlights exploded to life, turning the desert night into day. The men inside the SUV recoiled, shielding their eyes from the sudden brightness. Then, a voice crackled through the SUV's radio. Jack's voice. calm, steady, deadly. You boys picked the wrong family. Luis's knuckles tightened around his gun. He turned to Claire, his patience finally snapping. He grabbed her by the arm, yanking her forward. "I don't know who you think you're scaring, old man," he shouted. "But if you don't back the hell off, your little girl—" He never finished his sentence, because Claire moved, fast, precise, just like her father taught her. She drove her knee into Luis's gut, twisting in his grip. The moment his hold loosened, she grabbed the pistol from his hand, flipping it around on him. Now, the gun was pointed at him. Outside, Jack stepped out of the truck. "Let her go," he said, his voice even, "or you won't be walking away from this." Luis gasped, doubling over as Claire's knee connected with his stomach. The gun had slipped from his fingers in the struggle, but now she held it. The cold steel felt heavier than she expected, but her grip was firm. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't scared. The other cartel members in the SUV froze. For the first time, they realized this wasn't going the way they had planned. Outside, the roar of Jack Morgan's 18-wheeler still filled the air, its floodlights blinding and unforgiving. He stood in front of it, his boots planted firmly in the dust, arms crossed over his chest. The desert wind kicked up his worn leather jacket, his face as unmoving as a mountain. "Let me make something real clear," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "You boys don't know who you're dealing with." Luis coughed and spat on the floor, rage burning in his eyes. "You think we're scared of some trucker?" Jack took a slow step forward. "Son, you should be." The SUV driver gripped the wheel with sweaty hands. We should go, man," he muttered. Luis shot him a glare. "Shut up." But the hesitation was already there. Jack could see it. Claire could see it. The fear was settling in. The girl they thought would be an easy target had fought back. The man they assumed was just another old trucker had hunted them down like animals. And now they had nowhere to run. Claire cocked the gun, keeping it steady on Luis. "I'd put my hands up if I were you." Luis's teeth clenched. He was humiliated. A young woman had disarmed him, and now, in front of his own men, she held the power. Jack walked up to the SUV, his boots crunching in the dirt. The driver shrank back. The youngest cartel member, the one who had yanked Claire's hair earlier, refused to meet his eyes. Jack leaned forward, resting an arm against the SUV's open door. "Tell me something, fellas," he said. "What's your boss gonna say when he finds out you got outplayed by a trucker and his daughter?" No one spoke. Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "That's what I thought." He turned his gaze back to Luis. "You're about to lose more than your pride, boy. The only reason you're still breathing is because my daughter decided to show you mercy." Luis's jaw tightened. His pride was shattered. His reputation ruined. If word got back to the cartel that he had been bested by a trucker's family, his days were numbered. Jack leaned in closer, his voice turning ice cold. "You leave this place, and you never come back. You don't look for us. You don't even think about us. Because if I ever see you again—" He let the silence stretch before finishing. "You won't get a second warning." Luis's eyes darted between Jack and Claire, looking for a way out. But there wasn't one. Slowly, he raised his hands. The other cartel members followed his lead, dropping their weapons to the ground. Jack smiled. Smart choice. He looked at Claire. "Let's go, kid." Claire exhaled and tossed the gun onto the SUV's seat. She didn't need it anymore. They had already won. As she climbed into her father's truck, she glanced back at the men, defeated, humiliated, completely powerless. Jack stepped back into the cab, shifting the truck into gear. As they pulled away, the cartel thugs watched in silence, knowing that this night would haunt them forever. They had kidnapped the wrong girl. and they had learned the hard way that some families are not to be messed with. As the 18-wheeler rumbled down the highway, Claire leaned her head against the passenger window, staring at the desert fading into the night. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, but the reality of what had happened was starting to settle in. She had fought back. She had outplayed men who thought they were untouchable. And her father, he had come for her without hesitation. Jack's hands were steady on the wheel, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the road ahead. He hadn't spoken since they left the scene. Claire knew why. He wasn't just angry, he was calculating. She turned to him. "You think they'll come back?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He exhaled through his nose, considering his words. Then he glanced at her. "Not if they're smart." Claire nodded, but something still weighed on her. "And if they're not?" Jack tightened his grip on the wheel. "Then they won't get a second warning." There was no bravado in his voice, no empty threats, just certainty. The kind that came from a lifetime of knowing how the world really worked. For a long time, they drove in silence, the desert stretching endlessly on either side of them. Finally, Jack reached over and turned the radio dial, filling the cab with the familiar hum of classic rock. It was subtle, but Claire knew it for what it was. A return to normal. A reminder that they had survived. Claire looked down at her hands, her knuckles raw from the fight, her wrists still red from the zip ties. She had never imagined herself in a situation like this. She had grown up hearing her father's stories about the dangers of the road, about the men who preyed on the weak, who thought truckers were just easy targets. Tonight, she had proven them wrong. She glanced at her father. "You always knew this was possible, didn't you?" Jack sighed. "You spend enough years on the road, you see things. You hear stories. I told you to be careful for a reason." Claire swallowed, her throat tight. "Yeah, I get it now." Jack's eyes softened. "You did good, kid." She let out a shaky breath, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Yeah? Thought I was just slowing you down." Jack chuckled. "Hell, Claire. You handled yourself better than half the guys I've run with." That meant something coming from him. The headlights of passing cars flashed through the cab, and Claire let herself relax for the first time since this nightmare began. She wasn't just a trucker's daughter. She wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor. And those men? They would never forget what happened tonight. The cartel operated on fear. It was how they controlled people, how they kept their power. But tonight, they had been the ones to fear. Their leader had been humiliated, their reputation shattered. The story of what happened would spread through their ranks like wildfire. No one would want to be the next Luis. And if they ever were stupid enough to come back, they wouldn't be facing a scared girl. They'd be facing a trucker's daughter who knew how to fight back. Jack reached over, ruffling Claire's hair the way he used to when she was a kid. "Let's get you home." Claire nodded, leaning back in her seat, the vibration of the truck's engine lulling her into exhaustion. As the highway stretched before them, one question lingered in her mind. How many other people had been taken just like she had? How many hadn't been saved? She knew she was lucky. Not everyone had a father like Jack Morgan. Not everyone had someone willing to go to war for them. And that was the part that didn't sit right with her. She looked over at Jack. "You ever think about what happens to the ones who don't make it out?" Jack's expression darkened. "Yeah," he admitted. "More than you know." Claire was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "We should do something about that." Jack turned to look at her, surprised. Then, slowly, he nodded. A new idea was forming between them. Maybe this wasn't the end of the story. Maybe this was just the beginning.